Greetings, North and Central America. This is 21st Century Radio's Hieronymus and Company, where knowledge comes first, reminding you that we're not just the people from any city or state in the Union, and we're not just the folks from the east or west coasts of America. We're not only Americans, Occidentals, or Orientals. We are people from the planet Earth. We are Earth people. Did Jesus Christ have extraterrestrial contact? Was the Christ a student of extraterrestrials? Or was Jesus Christ an extraterrestrial himself? Well, Dr. James Deardorff's book, Celestial Teachings, published by Wildflower Press, will fill us in on this, and this will be a world exclusive, friends. Group of goodies at 24 minutes past the hour. Now on with the show. Many of you have heard the story about how Dr. Bob was on his way to becoming a minister when he learned that many within the profession didn't share his enthusiasm about the meaning or importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Gnostics, or the Essenes. Years later, I heard rumors about some lost scrolls which suggested that Jesus Christ had extraterrestrial contact. The book in question was called Talmud Emanuel, and the individual who was responsible for protecting its contents was Edward Billy Meier, a UFO contactee throughout the 60s and 70s. We discussed this work with Desiree Stevens in talking about the publication, and they called his name Emanuel, published by America West about a year ago. Long before then, however, I'd been in contact with Brian Crissey at Wildflower Press about the material we're going to discuss this hour. 2 books have been offered by Wildflower Press that should be in your library: Celestial Teachings, The Emergence of the True Testament of Emmanuel Jesus, and the second is called The Talmud of Emanuel, which we may cover in the coming months. Tonight, we have online Dr. James Deardorff, author of Celestial Teachings, as well as publisher Brian Crissey of Wildflower Press. Welcome to 21st Century Radio's Hieronymus and Company, where knowledge comes first. James and Brian.
Hello, Bob.
Well, first we're going to talk with James, and then later Brian will fill us in on why it's been so difficult to have these books printed. And boy, it's been a struggle, hasn't it, Jim? Brian. Brian and Jim.
Yeah, well, it's taken quite a while, that's for sure.
Yeah. James, the Talmud Emanuel, let's get into its history. When was it found?
Well, it was discovered in 1963 by a Lebanese priest in Jerusalem, or in the Jerusalem area. He had a Greek Orthodox congregation there, and he was evidently prompted through mental telepathy from the Pleiadians, the same group that was contacted Meier starting in 1975, on where to go to unearth these scrolls. He found them encased in rosin under a stone in an old tomb site, and after some digging, found these things, but found they were written in Aramaic, and he was able to slowly translate portions of them, and found it was very heretical for Christianity, because it seemed to tell what actually was Jesus' true teachings that had been strongly distorted in the early 2nd century to form the Gospel of Matthew, and then the subsequent Gospels came out similarly. So he couldn't just turn these scrolls over to religious authorities or anything, expect them ever to see the light of day. But through no accident, Meier was also visiting the Mid-East area at that time and met the priest and convinced him to translate them into German, which is his language of northern Switzerland. And so he eventually turned the translations over to Meier, and on Meier's first contact in 1975, he was told by his chief contactor, Sannyasi, to distribute these writings. They were, as far as they were concerned, the most important writings on Earth. And Meier then edited them and got them ready for publishing in 1978, and has been selling them at cost ever since.
Well, let me ask you, what happened to the Greek priest who undertook this project?
Well, somehow they couldn't keep it secret. He soon became an ex-priest. He probably had to explain why he was leaving the church and so on. And he had to eventually flee Jerusalem. Every so often he would mail or send Meier what he had translated into German up to that point. And eventually Israeli authorities caught up with him in a refugee camp in Lebanon, and the original scrolls were destroyed then. He escaped but was killed a couple of years later in Baghdad. So now all we have left is the German version itself to try to ascertain whether it's the true, authentic teachings or not. And Meier's own words for what happened, plus one copy of a letter from Rashid, the name of the priest, to Meier, saying how he was being persecuted by both Christians and Israelis in 1974.
Okay, that's a very good review of what, to bring us up to date so we can discuss this. Why does this book refer to Jesus Christ as Emmanuel?
Well, that's one of the many, many heresies in it for Christianity. It says his real name had been Emanuel. And the name Jesus, along with Christ, it didn't get pinned on him until mid-1st century by Paul, because it fit Paul's theology. The name Jesus in Hebrew, Yeshu, meaning God saves, implying God saves us from our sins.
Mm-hmm.
So he sort of just changed the name to fit his own theology, and his views dominated. And later, when this document reached the Palestinian area in the early 2nd century, he had been already known as Jesus for a good many, several decades, and that all the names had to be changed into Jesus that was found in this document as it was converted into the Gospel of Matthew.
Mm-hmm. Well, in your estimation, why shouldn't this work be considered a hoax?
Well, that's the question I've had to have in my own mind, of course, for the last 6 or 8 years in studying this, and all my own research has been directed towards trying to answer this. I've found over 200 different verses that gospel scholars have objected to in the Gospel of Matthew that they think aren't really authentic in the Gospel of Matthew. And a lot of these verses have parallel verses in this Talmud Emanuel document, and yet the Talmud Emanuel document doesn't suffer from these criticisms by the New Testament scholars.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at them and see how intricate some of these changes were, a lot of verses were condensed down to just a few verses that didn't make much sense in the Gospel of Matthew. You can see how it could have been taken in that direction, but you're hard-pressed to explain how a hoaxer could take it from a short, fragmented version into a more complicated version, yet has its own consistent message throughout a text.
Mm-hmm. You note that it may remove a number of minor objections that have been raised only several years after the Talmud Emanuel was first printed as well. I really enjoyed this book on many levels. I think the way you, with the method that you chose to suggest or indicate that it had credibility, I think most people would be able to go along with that method. Dr. Jim? I'll call you Dr. Jim. Is that all right, Jim?
That's fine.
All right. There has been considerable controversy over which gospel came first, and that is also which is more accurate. Presently, biblical scholars think Mark's gospel was first. Why do you disagree with this conclusion?
Well, of course, I more or less went along with it from what little I knew before I learned about the Meier case and started studying the Talmud Emanuel. Then I really found all kinds of reasons why the Talmud Emanuel was converted first into the Gospel of Matthew, and the Mark's Gospel did come second. There still is a minority of scholars that think the Gospel of Matthew did come first, and they have very good arguments that they can show why the Gospel of Mark didn't come first. Right now, the main reasons I think Mark came first, the majority consensus anyhow, is simply because Mark is shorter and has cruder German in its 4th or 5th century text, which is about the earliest we can go back to in the Greek text, than Matthew does. So it seems like maybe it came first. But others have pointed out, scholars, that it's even easier to take a longer work and abridge it into a shorter one, since Mark is shorter than Matthew. And we learn from the testimony of Papias that Matthew compiled his gospel in Hebrew from the Logia, he called it. The rest of the statement is, and each interpreted them as best they could, so that implies that the first gospel, namely Matthew's, came out in Aramaic or Hebrew, which then would explain why the first gospel in Greek could have been Mark's. So there's a lot of things that I went into that showed by comparing the order of Mark's events against Matthew's that it really looks like it was Mark that copied from Matthew rather than vice versa.
Very interesting. A very interesting analogy and analysis there. This scroll was originally found in 1963 by a Lebanese priest, and it was written in Aramaic, and it was translated into Greek, and that Greek priest lost his life, and the scrolls were destroyed.
It was translated into German.
Into German, yes. Yep. All right, friends. Well, right now, It's time to pause for another brief moment to allow a few of our stations to rejoin the network. All right, let's get back to our friend here, Dr. James Deardorff. When did Emanuel allegedly have E.T. contact, Jim?
Well, the first one, well, I should say, first of all, it appears that his contactors were the same ones that have been contacting Meier, at least contacted Meier from 1975 through 81, the ones who told him they're from the Pleiades. I think the first contact that the Talmud Emanuel would indicate when Emanuel was an adult occurred during the 40 days and nights that Matthew's Gospel say he was tempted by the devil.
Mm-hmm.
And this followed the baptism in the Jordan River, where Matthew describes as something like a spirit like a dove descended down, and then right after the baptism, something, the devil whisked Jesus away. Well, in the Talmud Emanuel, you see that this looks like sort of like what's happened in various newspaper reports today of UFOs. Really shocking things get omitted or transformed into something else that is more understandable to the people, that weeds out the UFO aspects. And so during those 40 days and nights, he seems to be in a typical contactee rather than abductee, and was given all kinds of teachings as to his mission, what it would be, and a lot of information. And it's very interesting reading in the Talmud Emanuel at that point.
Well, what material exists which suggests that Emmanuel's father was possibly an E.T.?
Yeah, well, at that same event, the voice that spoke out from the sky in Matthew spoke out from this metallic light in the Talmud Emanuel to say, "This is my son in whom I'm well pleased." And this was Gabriel, and he was no angel. He was an extraterrestrial, one of the representatives of this, or chief right-hand man of this group and of the Pleiadians at that time. And their chief headman, you might say, was overlooking various races on Earth, according to the Talmud Emanuel, which calls him God, actually. It's sort of a title. We suppose perhaps in Aramaic that was a word that was written as El, perhaps, or Eloah. And, well, where was I here? Anyhow, that was where Gabriel's influence comes in, as well as earlier when he was talking to Joseph to explain to him that he was his wife-to-be was going to have a baby, and Gabriel was the father.
So what we have here within the New Testament is a very bright light, metallic light,
mm-hmm.
which we believe Emmanuel, or Jesus Christ, entered, was there for at least 40 days. The father of Emmanuel then is the angel Gabriel.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And the person responsible for seeing to it that the Talmud Emanuel met the light of day was Brian Crissey of Wildflower Press. And Brian's with us. Hello, Brian.
Fine.
Brian, I want to make sure we give out the address of Wildflower Press.
All right.
It's, of course, Wildflower Press is one word, except for press is the second word. Post Office Box 230-893, Tigard, T, is it T-Y-E-G-I-R-D?
It's T-I-G-A-R-D.
Oh, T-I-G-A-R-D, Tigard, Oregon, 97224.
That's right.
Now, Brian, you and I have been conversing for about, I guess, almost 2 years now.
Mm-hmm.
When did you learn about this book, Talmud Emanuel?
I learned about it through having met Jim Deardorff. The first time that I met Jim was at a television program on UFO sightings that we both had come to. Later, he spoke several times at a group that we had set up in Portland for persons who have had experiences and want to have other persons that they can talk to about the experiences without being laughed at. And we set this group up, and it's been very popular and has grown, and Jim has spoken at that several times. And he has been working on this number of years now, and expressed a desire at that point to have it published, and was sharing the information that he was having difficulty getting a publisher to look at it because it is quite heretical, and there are major risks associated with taking on a project like this, and no one seemed to be able to come up with the courage to take it on. So we had a fledgling publishing company set up at that time, and thought we would take on Jim's book on this because he makes such a convincing case for this, and if there is something to this, this is likely to be one of the more important documents in the 20th century, at least, maybe one of the important documents in the last 2,000 years, and we need to be very careful with it and do a good job with it, and Jim's book really sets that stage. It needs to come out, so we took it on, and when we took it on, then it became very clear that when people would read his book, the next question was, where do we get the actual Talmud of Emanuel itself? And that raised other issues because the TJ, as we call it, the Talmud of Emanuel, was published some years back in a small German version by Edward Meier, but apparently there's a number of mistakes and omissions and problems in that version that were due to the fact that Meier did not have an opportunity to proofread it or edit it before it went to press. So Meier was not satisfied with that original version, but there were a few of those available, but they were in German. There's some bad copies or bad translations into English that were not done carefully, but they weren't really properly done. So the answer was it wasn't available, which led us to communicate directly with Edward Meier in Switzerland to get the rights to do a proper English translation and bring it out for the public. And Edward Meier is a controversial figure himself, and there's been a number of persons, normally, I think usually it's been Americans that have done bad things to him, said one thing, done another thing, and he's grown so that he doesn't distrust Americans, or so he does distrust Americans, which put us in a bad light. So it took us a while to gain his confidence, and we went through a number of dead ends before we finally came to the point that we're at now, where he is actively involved in the process of bringing out the correct version of the Talmud of Emanuel, including the omissions that had been left out of the earlier version, and we're doing a very careful translation into English, and it's just a beautiful thing to see. You know, it's a wonderful document to read, and we almost went to print with it and had to call that off because there were some additional changes that had to be made before we were able to bring it out. So it's almost ready to go to print again. And in finding out why these changes had to be just so, and talking to Edward Meier, he says a very interesting thing that the Pleiadians, and he names several of these, Semyaze and Ptah and Quetzal and some others that are working through him to make sure that this is the correct version on the German side, and that there is a code that is inside the German version of the Talmud of Emanuel, which has to be just so. And he says it's in every letter and every word of every verse. And he says that it speaks to a group of people on this planet that he refers to as being a codex. And I'm not sure what a codex is, other than it's perhaps a set of people who are sensitized or programmed, perhaps, to receive this message. And it comes only through the German, and it comes through either looking at the German or hearing it read. And if we just read through the English side, you can get the content, but the message doesn't come across. And so he insisted that the German be printed side by side with the English or with any other translations in other languages, so that message can be imparted to whomever it's going to. So it's a very mysterious kind of thing.
It sure is. Well, Brian, I want to thank you for stopping by 21st Century Radio. And please hang on the line, because we obviously want to continue with our conversation with Dr. Jim Deardorff. By the way, friends, anyone out there who can tell us the press that printed this book that we're talking about, Celestial Teachings, will win a copy of Celestial Teachings. Call us right now, 1-800-487-8255. Tell us which press got it together to publish Celestial Teachings and the Talmud Emanuel, and you'll win a copy of that book. All right, right now, friends, what we need to do is pay for our show, and we'll be back in a few minutes. Let's get quickly back to Dr. James Deardorff and have no more interruptions, hopefully, for the next 15 minutes. Dr. Deardorff, thank you for hanging on there. Now, how is St. Paul viewed through the Talmud Emanuel? Jim?
His disclosures about Paul in the Talmud Emanuel, it turns out that Paul did hear Emanuel's teachings on at least one occasion and didn't like them. This was, of course, a couple of years before Saul's conversion. He was called Saul then. And so he was sort of teaming up with another fellow by the name of Judah E. Harriet, plus other Pharisees, to try to do Emanuel in. But then Emanuel chose his own time and everything for this to happen following the Last Supper, as we know. Anyhow, this would have been a very shameful episode for Paul to have had disclosed later, and it's no surprise then that when the compiler of Matthew's Gospel did his job and edited the Talmud Emanuel, he left that part out. But it would help explain why Paul was persecuting the earliest Christians, the disciples, so strongly there for a couple of years. You can understand that he must have heard Emanuel speak himself to have gotten up such a hatred.
Yeah, that was amazing.
Then the conversion, of course, turned everything around, and the Talmud Emanuel has a very interesting story on that indicates, well, we haven't really gone in enough details to indicate the survival of the crucifixion. It's almost too much to try to present to listeners all at once.
Well, we're going to touch on it really rapidly. I think it's important that the certain points really should be made, such as Emanuel says that Judas Iscariot did not betray him. So who did?
And then this young fellow by the name of Judah E. Harriet. The name was so similar that after Judah E. Harriet repented the day afterwards and committed suicide, his father, who was an important Pharisee, and the chief priest, one of them anyhow, decided that, well, let's save you from embarrassment and just say it was Judas Iscariot, the disciple, who did the betrayal and committed suicide. And furthermore, at the same time, we'll be casting great doubt upon Emanuel's teachings, which the Pharisees and chief priests had been trying to do all along.
And what about, we just want to briefly mention this, so Emanuel did not die on the cross.
No, that's right. And later, he was in Syria for a couple of years incognito, and later moved on eventually towards India. And it's about that point where the story gets lost. But we shouldn't forget to mention the heart of the Talmud Emanuel itself is what Emanuel did teach that couldn't make it into the Gospels, his teachings about the spirit and the human individual spirit, its evolution and immortality and power, and of course karma and reincarnation comes into that.
Now, Jim, do you think that this material which you just mentioned was deliberately excerpted from the Bible?
It just was not put into Matthew's Gospel when he read the Talmud Emanuel, when he got a hold of it in the early 2nd century, because it had long since, for example, reincarnation had been anathema to the early church ever since Paul preached the resurrection idea. And Paul had been a Pharisee himself, and the Pharisees had for a century and a half before the Christian era even believed in a resurrection of sorts. So reincarnation went against that concept, and it just couldn't be tolerated.
Well, one of the things that I found very informative, because I've studied some of the Gnostic teachings, tell us a little bit about the Gnostics and why they've run amok, so to speak, amongst traditional mainstream Christianity.
Well, we really don't know much about the Gnostics until the find and place in Egypt occurred in the early 1940s that uncovered some of them. except for what some of the early Christian fathers spoke out against the Gnostics, and we don't know how one-sided they were when they went out against the Gnostic teachings. But it looks like these Gnostics, for some reason, didn't get going until into the 2nd century, and you might wonder why didn't the Gnostic movement start right up following Jesus or Emanuel's teachings during his ministry in the 1st century, if that's what got it started. Yeah. And it looks like since the Talmud Emanuel didn't appear on the scene until the early 2nd century, that some others got to read it besides just the compiler of Matthew's Gospel. And out of that then rose the main part of the Gnostic movement. But they didn't have any way of preserving their writings, and it very quickly became very distorted into all kinds of oddball things.
Interestingly enough, they, of course, talked about 2 gods. Could you explain this to us? Because this is where the Talmud Emanuel clears up a very interesting point.
Yeah, that is very interesting. That there was one God that was a sort of a god of the spirit, the good God. This is what the Marcionites and Valentinians and others taught. And that there was a second God that was concerned with people on earth and giving the prophets their messages and things like that. Well, this second God then would refer to what we call extraterrestrials today. And then the first God would be true God or spirit.
The creator God.
Yes.
So in fact, what you're talking about, the difference between ETs, highly advanced humanoid types, and the Supreme Being.
Right, and this is what Emanuel taught. It's in the Talmud Emanuel. But you can see it just couldn't really be understood at that time. There was no way to describe the extraterrestrials very well to get that concept across. And, of course, the word extraterrestrial doesn't even appear in Talmud Emanuel.
Yeah. So, boy, what we know from the New Testament is considerably different from what we're learning from the Talmud Emanuel. And no wonder there's going to be some real problems with it. To possibly have the suggestion that there were extraterrestrials, that reincarnation was important, the fact that the possibility that Jesus may not have died on the cross, that he went on to India. Now there have been other sources that have related that Jesus went on to India. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. There's a book by Holger Kirsten about Jesus living in Kashmir in particular. For a good long time at the end of the 1st century, and he has records of 21 different documents that attest to this fact. Of course, he may be wrong in some of them, but it's hard pushed to get rid of all 21.
And then the other aspect of it is that Emanuel then married and had some children.
He wasn't abnormal or anything, and he married in India, and it was his oldest son that was given the task right after Emanuel died, to transport these writings that had been written by one of the disciples who went to India with him, to transport them back to the Palestinian area. And evidently one set of the scrolls then got handed to the early church and fell into the hands of the compiler of Matthew's Gospel, and the other set got buried in the old tomb site near Jerusalem, not to be discovered until 1963.
And who was the mysterious character that noted all of this information down?
Well, it was Emmanuel's most trusted disciple, which turns out to be Judas Iscariot, as you already mentioned, since he wasn't the one who betrayed Emmanuel or committed suicide, and he had been designated as treasurer. It's not too surprising that he would have been the writer of the group, too.
Now, Jim, what's the connection between Emanuel and the Essenes and possibly the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Well, there's really hardly any connection at all. It appears that Emanuel did have one run-in with the Essenes and encounter with them, and he told them he didn't want to join the group or anything. This was a couple of years after crucifixion, when they were someone in Damascus or I think it was Damascus, maybe it was one of the other cities, happened to recognize him and took him to their group. And he then later fled that area just to escape the Essenes, which of course runs counter to plenty other channelings and other things you'll read about, that maybe Emanuel or Jesus was an Essene. We have all kinds of opinions floating around out there on that. Emanuel won't support any strong Essene connection.
Very interesting. You know, I would have thought that it might have, but it doesn't. The Lord's Prayer, I've made a study of it and named my second mural at Johns Hopkins University after it. The Lord's Prayer in the Talmud Emanuel is considerably different than the one found in Matthew, the one found in Matthew. What's the difference between those two?
Well, Matthew's prayer is a corporate prayer. It's Our Father and on earth our bread and all that, whereas the Talmud Emanuel prayer is a prayer to the individual spirit. So it's quite different. There are a few phrases and fragments of it that got carried over into Matthew's corporate prayer. But praying to your spirit then is sort of like meditating, trying to get in contact with it and ask that you receive your daily dose of spiritual information.
So it really takes the part seriously about the Christ within you and the hope for glory.
Right, although it's your own spirit within you.
Yes, it's the God within us. Literally and this, of course, runs into all kinds of problems when you get to the Christian fundamentalists who would like to translate that a little differently. Now, one last thing, and then we've got to go. You had some disagreements with the book, and they called his name Emanuel. What are one or two of the more important ones?
The book, and they called his name Emanuel?
Yeah, published by America West.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was a channeling of the 1984...
Hold it right there. We'll get back in just a second. Right now, friends, let's welcome our affiliates back to 21st Century Radio and the American Radio Networks. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio's Hieronymus and Company, where knowledge comes first. We're talking about the book. Actually, we're finishing up right now. The next 30 or so seconds, the Wildflower Press, published Celestial Teachings, Post Office Box 230893, Tigard, Oregon 97224. Congratulations to our winner down there in WNUE who won a copy of Celestial Teachings. Now, Jim, in about 30 seconds or less, what were you about ready to say concerning some of the possible disagreements with and they called his name Emanuel?
Yes, this was a channeling that came out a couple of years ago that America West distributed, and it channels the Talmud Emanuel, but it channels the 1984 English version of it complete with all its mistranslations and mistakes. So it's sort of a extraterrestrial plagiarization through channeling is what it looks like.
Well, isn't that interesting? Well, Jim and Brian, I want to thank you very much for stopping by 21st Century Radio's Hieronymus and Company, where knowledge comes first. I am looking forward to reading the final copy of the Talmud Emanuel, and I very much enjoyed Celestial Teachings. It certainly has opened things up in areas that I needed opening up.
Thank you, Bob.
You're very welcome.